She was 41 years old, and by the spring of 1891 she owned nothing but the clothes on her back, a dead husband's pocket watch, and $11 folded into a handkerchief. The bank in Sable Draw, Arizona Territory, had taken her ranch, her cattle, and the well her husband had dug with his own 2 hands. And the man who signed the papers that ruined her, a banker named Silas Vane, had done it all with a smile. Calling it business, calling it the natural order of things. All she had left in the world was that handkerchief of coins. And with it she did something the whole town called foolish. She walked into the county clerk's office and claimed the old condemned saloon at the edge of Sable Draw, a building so far gone that the clerk laughed and told her, "Take it. Nobody wants it," and let it go for $9 in back taxes. She told herself she was only buying 4 walls and a roof to keep the sun off her head. She did not know that beneath the warped floorboards of that dying saloon lay a sealed room that had been waiting more than 30 years to be found. A room that would not only save her, but would force an entire town to remember a truth it had spent a generation trying to forget. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marion Calloway. If you are watching this from a place that other people have written off as worthless, tell us where you're from in the comments, because this story is for you. Marion had not always been a woman with nothing. She had been born Marion Ashby in 1850, in a wagon somewhere between Missouri and the Territory, the daughter of a blacksmith who believed above all things that a tool's worth was never decided by how it looked but by what it could still do. Her father, Elias Ashby, kept a forge in every town they passed through long enough to plant a garden, and from him Marion learned 2 things that would shape the whole of her life: how to read the true condition of a thing beneath its rust, and how to listen, really listen, to old men and women who nobody else thought worth the time. She used to sit on an overturned bucket in her father's shop, while retired trappers and freedmen and Mexican vaqueros waited for their tools to be mended, and she would ask them questions and they would answer, because a girl on a bucket asking sincere questions was rarer and more welcome than she ever understood at the time. Her mother Louisa taught her herbs and stitching and the particular economy of a household that had almost nothing and wasted even less. By the time Marion was 17, she could set a broken bone, patch a roof, douse for water with a forked willow branch the way her father had shown her, and keep a ledger so precise that a merchant in Prescott once offered to pay her wages just to balance his books for a season. She married Thomas Calloway in 1869, a quiet, sun-browned rancher from a family that had come into the Territory even before the Ashbys, and together they built a modest spread 11 miles outside a dusty crossroads that would later grow into the town of Sable Draw. Thomas was not a rich man, but he was a careful one, and the well he dug on their land went deep, sweet, and reliable in a country where water broke fortunes as often as it made them, became something of a local landmark. Ranchers from 3 days' ride would stop at the Calloway well to water their stock, and Thomas never once charged a man a nickel for it because, he said, water was not a thing decent people should have to buy from one another. Marion bore 2 children in those years, a son who died of fever before his 3rd birthday and a daughter, Ada, who grew up strong and clever and was, by the time she was 15, already teaching the younger children in Sable Draw their letters in the back room of the Mercantile. It was, by every measure that mattered to Marion, a good life, hard, dry, unglamorous, but good, built on the same quiet principle her father had given her: care for what is in front of you, and it will care for you in return. It was Thomas's death in the winter of 1884 that began the slow unraveling. He was thrown from a horse during a storm and lingered 3 days before he passed. And in the confusion and grief that followed, Marion discovered that Thomas had, in the last year of his life, taken a loan against the ranch from the newly opened Sable Draw Trust and Savings, a bank owned and run by a smooth, soft-spoken man named Silas Vane, who had arrived in the Territory only 2 years before with capital. Nobody could quite account for, and an unnerving talent for knowing exactly which families were one bad season away from ruin. Thomas had borrowed against the well itself, against the water rights. Specifically, to cover a debt from a cattle drive gone wrong, and he had died before he could tell Marion the particulars, or perhaps before he had fully understood them himself. Marion spent years afterward believing she could work her way clear of it. She sold off stock. She took in mending. She rented out grazing land to smaller ranchers who could not afford Vane's rates, and for a while, it seemed to be enough. It was not enough. In 1889, a drought settled over the Sable Draw Valley that would not break, and one by one the small ranchers around Marion began to fail, and one by one their land found its way, through foreclosure or forced sale, into the growing portfolio of Silas Vane, who was by then not merely a banker, but the single largest landowner in 3 counties. Marion held on longer than most, in part because of the well, whose water she still refused to sell dear even as thirstier men offered her small fortunes for it. But in the autumn of 1890, Vane called due the note Thomas had signed 6 years before, citing a clause about water rights collateral that Marion had never fully understood, and that her own lawyer, an overworked young man named Percival Gates, admitted he could not entirely untangle either. The foreclosure hearing lasted less than 20 minutes. Marion stood in the back of a hot little courtroom in Prescott and watched a judge who owed his appointment to men like Vane sign away 11 years of her life. And Vane, seated at the front in a gray suit that had never once seen a day of honest labor, did not even look at her as it happened. Ada had married the year before and moved to Tucson with her husband. And so Marion left Sable Draw's outskirts alone, with a wagon, a mule, a trunk of her mother's linens, and the $11 that were, by the time she reached town, all that remained of a life built with 2 hands and a well that had once given water freely to anyone who asked. She might have kept walking. Many women in her position did, drifting toward whatever relative or charity might take them in. But something in Marion, some stubborn, forge-taught conviction that a thing's worth was never what it appeared to be on the surface, made her stop instead in front of the old saloon at the edge of Sable Draw's main street, a building everyone in town called, without much affection, the Rattler's Rest, though its actual sign, faded and half fallen from its hinges, read the Silver Spur. It had stood empty for nearly 6 years, ever since its last owner had died with no heirs and no will, and in that time it had become exactly the kind of place children dared each other to run past at dusk. Windows boarded, boards rotted, a lean to the whole structure that suggested it might simply give up standing one day without any drama at all. The county clerk, a weary, kind-eyed man named Otis Red, told her plainly that the back taxes owed on the lot came to $9 and that he would be, in his own words, downright relieved to have it off the county's books. "Take it," he said, sliding the paper across his desk toward her. "Nobody wants it." Marion signed her name, paid her $9, and became, in the space of a single dusty afternoon, the owner of the most unwanted building in Sable Draw, she told herself, as she pried the boards from the door that same evening with a crowbar borrowed from Otis, that she wanted nothing more than shelter, 4 walls, a roof, and enough privacy to decide what to do with the rest of her life. The inside of the Silver Spur smelled of dust and dry rot and something else beneath it, mineral and cool, like the inside of a well. The bar itself was still standing, warped but intact, a long slab of mesquite wood scarred with decades of cigarette burns and spilled whiskey, and behind it a broken mirror reflected her own tired face back at her in jagged pieces. She spent that first night sweeping, more out of restlessness than any real plan, and it was in sweeping the floor behind the bar that she noticed something odd, a section of floorboard wider than the others, that did not sit quite flush, and beneath it, when she pried it loose with the crowbar's edge, a draft of cool air rising up from the darkness like a breath, there was a stairway beneath the Silver Spur. It was narrow, cut crudely into the earth and shored up with old mesquite beams, and it descended perhaps 12 feet below the saloon floor into a root cellar that some earlier owner must have dug and then, for reasons she could not yet guess, sealed away and forgotten. She went down that first night with a lantern in one trembling hand and the crowbar in the other. More out of the same stubborn curiosity that had made her stop and ask questions of old men on a bucket 40 years before than out of any real bravery. The cellar was small, no bigger than a modest bedroom, and dry despite its depth. The walls lined with old shelving that had once held root vegetables and jarred preserves, most of it long since rotted to dust. But at the back of the cellar, half hidden behind a fallen shelf, Marion found a second door, not a cellar door but a proper one, hinged and paneled, entirely out of place in a root cellar, sealed with a heavy iron bolt gone orange with rust. It took her the better part of an hour, working the bolt loose with oil she fetched from the mercantile the next morning, and patience she had learned from her father's forge. But when the door finally gave way, what she found inside was not treasure in the way the word is usually meant. It was paper, boxes and boxes of it, wrapped in oilcloth to keep the desert damp away, ledgers and letters and rolled documents tied with ribbon gone brittle with age, and on top of the nearest box, in a hand that was careful and clearly a woman's, a single word written on a strip of leather: remember. It took Marion 3 full days of careful, patient reading, by lantern light in the evenings after she had spent her days scraping together what work she could find in town, to understand what she had found. And when she finally did understand it, her hands shook so badly she had to set the papers down and walk out into the cold desert night to steady herself. The oldest documents in the cellar dated back to 1852, nearly 40 years before, to the very founding of what would become Sable Draw, and they told a story entirely different from the one carved onto the brass plaque outside the town hall, the one that credited a man named Jedediah Sable with discovering the spring that gave the town both its water and its name. According to the ledgers, ink faded but legible, the spring had in fact been discovered and developed, dug wider, lined with stone, protected from collapse, 3 years before Jedediah Sable ever arrived in the valley, by a freedwoman named Ruth Jessup, who had come west from Louisiana with her husband and infant son seeking land where a black family might, for once, build something that could not be taken from them by the stroke of another man's pen. Ruth Jessup had filed a legitimate claim on the land, the very land the town now stood upon, under the homestead provisions then being loosely applied in the territory, and the papers in that cellar included a copy of that claim, signed and witnessed, dated a full 3 years before Jedediah Sable's own much later, much more convenient filing, the one the whole town's founding mythology rested upon. The story the papers told, pieced together across ledgers, letters, and what appeared to be a private diary kept by the saloon's original owner, a woman named Bertha Lindquist, who Marion slowly realized had been more than a barkeep, had in fact been a friend and confidant of Ruth Jessup's in the years after the Jessup family's disappearance from any official town record, was this: Jedediah Sable had arrived in the valley in 1855, 3 years after Ruth Jessup had already dug her well and built a small cabin near it, and rather than settle elsewhere as the land was plentiful, he had instead moved to force the Jessup family out, first through intimidation, then, when that failed, through a filing of his own claim that conveniently overlapped hers, backed by a friendly land agent who owed him favors and a magistrate who, Bertha's diary noted bitterly, would not hear a colored woman's claim spoken aloud in his courtroom, let alone written into his ledger. Ruth's husband, Isaiah, had been beaten within an inch of his life one night in 1856 by men nobody could later identify, and within a month the Jessup family had vanished from the valley entirely. Their claim quietly absorbed, their well relabeled as Sable's Spring, their name scrubbed so thoroughly from the town's memory that not even Marion, who had lived in the valley her entire adult life, had ever once heard it spoken. But Bertha Lindquist, it seemed, had not forgotten. She had kept every scrap of paper she could gather, copies of the original claim, letters from a sympathetic land office clerk in Prescott, who had helped smuggle documents out before Sable's allies could destroy the official record. Even a photograph badly faded of Ruth Jessup standing proud and unsmiling before the very well that would one day bear another man's name. And in the last entry of her diary, dated only weeks before her own death in 1885, Bertha had written words that Marion read over so many times she came to know them by heart. "I have sealed these papers where I pray they will outlast the men who would burn them, and I trust that whoever finds them will be someone the town has also tried to forget, and will therefore understand exactly what must be done." Marion did not sleep well after that. She was by then no stranger to being forgotten, to having her worth measured and dismissed by men who mistook a quiet, careful woman for an easy one to push aside. And she understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that the papers in that cellar were not merely history. They were a debt owed, one that had waited more than 30 years for someone willing to collect it honestly, on behalf of people who could no longer collect it for themselves. She began cautiously to make inquiries about the Jessup family, writing letters to land offices in 3 counties, and it was through the same young lawyer who had failed to save her ranch, Percival Gates, now working out of Prescott, that she finally learned Ruth and Isaiah Jessup had resettled after their expulsion in a freedman's community near Tucson, and that Ruth herself had died in 1889, but that her grandson, a blacksmith named Thomas Jessup, no relation by name to Marion's own late husband, though the coincidence struck her as almost too tender to be accidental, was alive and living not 40 miles from Sable Draw, working a small forge in a town that had never once acknowledged that his family's true home lay just up the valley road. She might have used what she found to buy herself a comfortable future, and no one who knew what Vane had done to her would have blamed her for it. The documents alone, properly presented, could likely have forced a cash settlement from a town eager to avoid scandal. But Marion had spent her whole life being taught that the worth of a thing was in what it could still do for others, not merely in what it could be sold for, and so instead of quietly negotiating a payoff, she did something far riskier. She went to Otis Red, the county clerk, and to the editor of the Sable Draw Courier, a plain-spoken woman named Frances Doyle, who had long harbored her own quiet suspicions about the tidiness of the town's founding story. And she laid the papers out on Frances's kitchen table and told her everything. The news. Once Frances Doyle printed it, carefully, methodically, with photographs of the original claim reproduced alongside Bertha Lindqvist's diary entries, tore through Sable Draw like a grass fire in July. Some in town were merely curious, even quietly ashamed, willing to sit with an uncomfortable truth about their own history. But Silas Vane, whose fortune and standing rested in no small part on land whose provenance traced back through Jedediah Sable's disputed claim, moved quickly and without hesitation to protect himself. He denounced the papers publicly as forgeries, hired a lawyer from Phoenix to threaten the Courier with a suit for libel, and come in a maneuver that revealed, Marion thought, exactly the kind of man he had always been. Quietly petitioned the county to have the Silver Spur condemned and demolished as a public hazard, papers and all, before any of it could be properly examined by an impartial authority. He came to see her himself one evening, standing in the doorway of the Silver Spur in that same gray suit, his voice as smooth as it had been the day he took her ranch, and he told her, not unkindly, that she was a sensible woman who understood how the world truly worked, and that a sensible woman in her position ought to consider what she stood to lose by continuing down this road, and what she might quietly gain by abandoning it. Marion told him in a voice steadier than she felt, that she had already lost everything he had the power to take from her, and that this, at least, was something he could not repossess. It was not bravado so much as simple fact, and something in Vane's face, a flicker of the same calculation she had seen in the courtroom the day he foreclosed her ranch, told her that he understood it too. In the weeks that followed, the town split roughly into 2 camps, those who sided quietly or loudly with Vane's insistence that old papers dug out of a saloon cellar by a ruined woman with an obvious grudge could hardly be trusted, and those growing steadily in number as Frances Doyle kept printing corroborating details, the land office clerk's letters, The photograph testimony gathered by Percival Gates from an elderly Prescott clerk, who remembered the original filing, who began to feel the uncomfortable, necessary weight of a truth too well documented to dismiss. The county board scheduled a hearing to decide once and for all both the condemnation of the Silver Spur and the validity of the Jessup claim, and Vane, sensing the tide was not moving cleanly in his favor, resorted finally to something closer to sabotage. One night, less than a week before the hearing, someone broke into the Silver Spur's cellar and attempted to set the remaining papers alight. And it was only because Marion, sleeping now in a cot behind the bar to guard what she had found, woke to the smell of smoke and beat the small fire out with her own coat, that the last of Bertha Lindqvist's records survived at all. The hearing itself, held in the same Prescott courthouse where Marion had once watched her ranch signed away in 20 minutes, lasted the better part of 2 days, and this time Marion did not stand quietly in the back. She testified herself plainly and without embellishment, walking the board through the papers exactly as she had found them, and Thomas Jessup, the blacksmith grandson she had traveled to meet in person weeks before, stood beside her and spoke of a grandmother who had told him stories of a well in a valley he had never been permitted to see, stories he had once assumed were simply an old woman's grief dressed up as memory. Francis Doyle's reporting, methodical and unflinching, had done its work in the court of public opinion long before the board ever convened. And when Vane's Phoenix lawyer attempted to argue the documents were fabricated, it was Otis Red himself, quiet and precise, who produced the original county land office ledger from 1852, a record Vane's own allies had apparently never thought to check, assuming, as men like Vane so often did, that no one would think to look. The board's ruling, when it came, did not restore the entire town to the Jessup family, as some had feared and others had hoped. The law, even when finally forced to see clearly, moved cautiously and incompletely, but it did formally recognize the original 1852 claim as valid. It did order the spring itself and a modest surrounding parcel returned to Thomas Jessup as Ruth's rightful heir. And it did, in a final humiliating stroke for Silas Vane, invalidate the water rights collateral clause under which he had foreclosed on Marion's own ranch 6 years before, on the grounds that the underlying land title had never been legitimately his bank's to leverage in the first place. What came after was not a fairy tale ending so much as a slow, deliberate repair. Marion did not seek to reclaim her old ranch outright. She had made peace, in the months of the investigation, with the idea that some things once lost cannot simply be undone, only honored differently going forward. But she did receive, as part of the settlement Percival Gates negotiated on her behalf, a fair cash restitution for the wrongful foreclosure, more money than she had held at any point since Thomas's death. Rather than use it to leave Sable Draw and start fresh somewhere the past could not find her, Marion chose instead to keep the Silver Spur, the unwanted saloon nobody had wanted, for $9, and to turn it, with Thomas Jessup's blessing and Francis Doyle's help, into something new, a modest boarding house and public meeting hall, its cellar cleared and repaired, its walls hung not with liquor advertisements but with the true history of the valley. Bertha Lindqvist's diary preserved under glass beside a copy of Ruth Jessup's original claim, so that no traveler passing through Sable Draw again could mistake the town's convenient legend for its actual memory. Silas Vane, stripped of his water collateral scheme and facing a wave of similar challenges from other ranchers who had lost land under identical clauses once word spread of what the courts had ruled, quietly sold his remaining holdings within the year and left the territory altogether. And if there was any justice sweeter to the people of Sable Draw than the truth itself, it was watching a man who had built his fortune on other people's desperation discover exactly how little that fortune was worth once no one trusted him enough to bank with him anymore. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, a 41-year-old widow with $11 to her name, standing before a condemned saloon that everyone in town had already given up on, being told, "Take it, nobody wants it." It would have been easy, looking at Marion Calloway that day, to see only what Silas Vane saw, a woman who had lost her land, her husband and very nearly her hope, buying the cheapest, most unwanted scrap of property in the county because she had nothing left to lose. But Marion had learned long before on an overturned bucket in her father's forge that the worth of a thing is never quite what it appears to be on the surface, that rust can hide sound iron, that a quiet woman can hold more resolve than a loud man twice her size, and that a building nobody wants can still, if you are patient and honest enough to look, be found to hold the truth an entire town has spent a generation trying to forget. She did not set out to become the person who rewrote Sable Draw's oldest memory. She only set out to survive the night, and to keep listening as her father had taught her, to what others had stopped bothering to hear. Thank you for spending this evening with Marion Calloway and the story of the Silver Spur, and if her patience moved you the way it moved us. We would be glad if you would share her story with someone who needs reminding that overlooked things and overlooked people are so rarely as worthless as the world decides to call them. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.